My son stood at the center of that living room on Christmas Eve, glowing like a man who had just won something very important, while his wife's entire family screamed and hugged each other over the brand new BMW sitting in the driveway with a red bow the size of a small child tied to its roof. I counted 7 people crying happy tears. 7. My daughter-in-law's mother pressed both hands to her cheeks and kept saying she could not believe it, that nobody had ever done anything so wonderful for her in her entire life. My son, Calvin, pulled her into a long hug while everyone clapped. I stood near the hallway with a cup of cold coffee in my hand and watched my only child give away what I later found out was $42,000 to a woman who had never once remembered my birthday. Then Calvin turned around and finally noticed me standing there. He walked over with a smile still on his face and handed me a small gift bag with red tissue paper sticking out of the top. Reached in and pulled out a tiny clear plastic bag. Inside was a single $3 scratch-off lottery ticket and a folded note that said, "Maybe you'll get lucky this year, Mom." The room did not go completely quiet, but the people nearest to me saw it. My daughter-in-law Priscilla saw it. Her sister saw it. And they both looked at me with the same careful expression people use when they are waiting to see if something embarrassing is going to happen. Calvin said, "Everyone gets what they bring to the table, Mom. You know how it is." He said it lightly, like it was barely a thing, like it was just a small truth everyone already understood. I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about the nights I worked overtime at the textile factory to keep his school fees paid. I thought about the year I sold my sewing machine, the one my own mother gave me, so Calvin could go on a class field trip to Washington because he wanted to go so badly. Thought about the little apartment on Reed Street where I raised him alone after his father walked out, where the heat sometimes did not work in January, and I would let Calvin sleep in my bed wrapped in my coat so he would stay warm. I thought about all of it in the space of about 4 seconds while standing in that bright, warm living room that I had helped him afford by lending him money I never asked back for. And then I smiled. I folded the scratch-off ticket carefully and put it in my coat pocket. I said, "Thank you, sweetheart. That was very thoughtful. Because my grandmother raised me to be composed even when your insides are shaking." I spent the rest of that evening sitting in a chair near the window while the party moved around me like water moving around a stone. Priscilla's family laughed loudly at everything. Her father, a man named Gerald who wore a watch I am quite sure cost more than my car, told the same 3 stories over and over, and got louder each time he told them. Priscilla's mother, Darlene, kept touching the car keys like she could not believe they were real. She made Calvin take 17 photographs of her standing beside the BMW. At dinner, I was seated at the very end of the table near the kitchen door, which swung open every time someone carried something out, so cold air hit the back of my neck throughout the entire meal. My name card was handwritten on a plain white square. Everyone else had printed cards with a small, decorative holly leaf in the corner. I noticed that, though I told myself it probably did not mean anything. The food was beautiful. Priscilla had ordered everything from a catering company, and the table was set with real silver that I later found out she had received as a wedding gift from her grandmother. I sat quietly and ate and listened and responded when someone spoke to me, which was not very often. After dinner, when the dishes were being cleared, Gerald tapped his glass and made a toast. About family being everything. About how the best gift you could give someone was your time and your love and your loyalty. He looked around the table while he said it with great feeling, and his eyes passed over me the way eyes pass over furniture. Calvin raised his glass and agreed completely. I excused myself to use the restroom and stood in the hallway for a moment just breathing slowly. On the wall outside the bathroom was a large framed family photo taken at Priscilla and Calvin's wedding 6 years ago. It was a beautiful photograph. The whole wedding party was arranged on wide stone steps in soft afternoon light. I found myself in it after a moment. I was in the back row, partially behind Priscilla's uncle, wearing the blue dress I had spent 3 weeks saving for. I looked happy in the photograph. I remembered that day and I had been happy. I had cried during the ceremony. I had danced until my feet ached. I had believed with my whole heart that Calvin had found a wonderful woman, and that our family was growing into something beautiful. I looked at the photograph for a while, Then I went back to the dining room and finished my coffee. By 9 o'clock the party was winding down. Priscilla's parents were the last to leave, and Darlene hugged Calvin for a long time at the door and told him he was the finest son-in-law any mother could ever hope for. Gerald shook his hand firmly and clapped him on the shoulder. Neither of them said goodbye to me, though I was standing 4 feet away with my coat already on. When the door closed, Calvin turned around looking satisfied and a little tired. Priscilla was already moving through the living room collecting glasses. I told Calvin I was going to head home. He nodded and said, "Drive safe, Mom, roads are probably icy." He did not hug me. He did not walk me to my car. Priscilla called from the other room, "Bye, Francis." I said goodbye and stepped out into the cold. The BMW was still sitting in the driveway under the porch light, enormous and white and gleaming. I walked past it to my 2009 Honda Civic with the cracked rear bumper and the heater that only worked on one setting, got in and drove home. The roads were icy. I drove slowly and carefully and did not cry until I was inside my own house with the door locked behind me. My name is Frances Elaine Whitmore and I am 67 years old. I worked for 31 years in textile manufacturing. First on the floor and then in quality control, until the plant closed and I retrained and spent the last 9 years of my working life as an administrative coordinator for a county health department. I retired 14 months ago. I live in the same house I bought 22 years ago on Oleander Street. A small brick house with a magnolia tree in the front yard that blooms every spring in a way that still surprises me no matter how many years I have watched it. It is a modest house and a modest life. And I have never once been ashamed of either. Calvin is my only child. I raised him from the time he was 6 years old on my own after my husband Raymond left for reasons he explained very thoroughly in a 4-page letter that I read once and then burned in the backyard. I did not burn it in anger. I burned it because I had made a decision that day to stop carrying things that were too heavy to carry and to use that energy for Calvin instead. Calvin was a good boy for a long time. He was curious and kind and funny in the dry, quiet way that made teachers love him. He worked hard in school and earned a partial scholarship to a state university, and I covered the rest by taking on weekend shifts at a grocery store for 3 years. He graduated with a degree in business administration and got a job at a logistics company and worked his way up, and I was proud of him in the uncomplicated and enormous way that only mothers who have sacrificed for their children truly understand. He met Priscilla at a work conference 7 years ago. She was polished and confident and beautiful, and I could see immediately why he fell in love with her. I tried to love her too. I want to be honest about that. I genuinely tried. I brought food to their apartment when they were first living together. I offered to help plan the engagement party. I bought a dress and pearls for the rehearsal dinner that I could not really afford because I wanted to look like someone who fit into the world Priscilla came from. But from the very beginning there was something in the way Priscilla looked at me that I could never quite name. Not hostility exactly. More like the polite distance a person keeps from something that does not quite belong in the picture they have imagined for their life. Over the years that distance had not closed. If anything, it had grown. And Calvin, my curious, kind, funny son, had gradually moved to stand on her side of it. That night I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and the $3 scratch-off still in my coat pocket. I took it out and looked at it. It was one of those tickets with cartoon snowflakes on it and silver coating over the play area. I got a fork from the drawer and scratched it off. I won $2. I put the ticket on the table next to my tea and sat there in my quiet kitchen for a very long time thinking. Thought about Darlene and her BMW. I thought about Gerald's watch and his toast about loyalty. I thought about Calvin's face when he said everyone gets what they bring to the table. I thought about the sewing machine I sold. I thought about Reed Street and the cold winters and the coat I shared. And then I thought about something else entirely. I thought about my late sister Vivien. Vivien had passed away 4 years ago, and she had left me something in her will that I had not touched because I could not bring myself to deal with it while I was still grieving. Vivien had been a careful, private woman who worked as a paralegal for 30 years and understood better than anyone in our family how quietly and completely a person could protect themselves if they made the right preparations at the right time. What she left me was not just money. It was a set of documents, a plan, and a letter that said, "Francis, you always put everyone else first. This is for the day when you finally decide to put yourself first instead." I had put that letter and those documents in a fireproof box in my bedroom closet and closed the lid. And I had not opened it again until the night I came home from Calvin's Christmas party with a $2 lottery win in my coat pocket. I opened the box at 10:30 that night, sitting on the edge of my bed in my pajamas with my reading glasses on, and I read everything Vivien had left me, very carefully for the first time. By midnight I understood what I had. By 1 in the morning I had made several decisions. By 2 in the morning I had started writing. By 3:30 I had finished. And at 4 o'clock in the morning on Christmas Day I got dressed, drove back to Calvin's neighborhood, and walked quietly up his driveway in the dark. The house was completely still. The porch light was off, but the Christmas lights on the gutters were still lit, and they gave off just enough light for me to move carefully. I did not ring the bell. Had a key. Calvin had given me a key 2 years ago when he had surgery and needed me to come check on the house. He had never asked for it back, which I think meant he had simply forgotten I had it, which told me something important about how present I was in his mind. I let myself in very quietly and went directly to the Christmas tree in the living room. Under it was a pile of gifts, most of them still wrapped from the exchange earlier that evening. The BMW keys were on the side table in a little dish shaped like a sleigh, which I thought was a nice touch. I placed my envelope under the tree, right in the center where it would be easy to find. It was a plain white envelope with Calvin's name written on the front in my handwriting. I took one last look around that living room with its beautiful furniture and its catered leftovers still on the kitchen counter, and the 17 photographs of Darlene and the BMW on Priscilla's phone that I knew would be posted by morning. Then I walked back out into the cold and drove home and slept better than I had slept in months. What was in that envelope would take Calvin 3 days to fully understand, and another 2 weeks to accept. And the effects of it were still unfolding a full year later in ways that none of us, not even Vivien in all her careful planning, could have entirely predicted. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand what was in that envelope, you first need to understand something about the house on Oleander Street and why it matters more than it might appear. When I bought that house 22 years ago, I bought it on my own with a down payment that I had saved over 6 years by living with extraordinary discipline. No vacations. No new car. No extras of any kind. Just work and save and wait. Raymond was already gone by then and Calvin was 8 years old, and I wanted one thing in the world with total clarity, which was a stable home that belonged to me and could not be taken from me by anyone or anything. I paid that mortgage every single month for 22 years, sometimes painfully, occasionally late, but never not at all. I made the final payment 14 months ago, 3 weeks after I retired. The same week I made that last payment, I sat at this kitchen table and cried for about 20 minutes, not from sadness but from the specific relief of something heavy being lifted that you have carried so long you forgot it was there. The house is mine entirely. No liens, no debt, nothing owed to anyone. It is worth, according to the county assessor's records and 2 independent appraisals I had done out of curiosity last spring, somewhere between $260,000 and $280,000, which is not a fortune but which is, in the context of my life, an extraordinary thing. Vivien knew about the house. She knew about everything, actually. That was the kind of person she was. She paid attention. She remembered details. She had a habit of knowing things quietly and without announcement, and then, when the right moment came, using what she knew with surgical precision. Growing up, she was the one who noticed when something was wrong before anyone else did. She was the one who saw patterns. She used to say that most people lived their whole lives reacting to things that a little careful attention would have allowed them to see coming. I thought about Vivien a great deal in the weeks following that Christmas. I thought about her the morning of Christmas Day when I woke up at 8 and made coffee and sat in my kitchen knowing that somewhere across town Calvin was opening his front door to get the newspaper and finding the lights still on and the envelope under the tree. I did not call him. I did not text him. I made my coffee and watched the magnolia tree through the kitchen window in the pale winter light and waited. He called at 9:47. I know the exact time because I had my phone face up on the table in front of me. I let it ring 4 times before I answered. Not to be dramatic, just to be calm. He said, "Mom, what is this?" His voice was strange. Not angry yet. More confused, in the way a person sounds when they have found something that does not match the story they have been telling themselves. I said, "Good morning, Calvin. Merry Christmas." He said, "Mom, this envelope has a letter from an attorney." I said, "Yes, it does." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It says you've placed the house in a trust." I said, "That's correct." He was quiet again, longer this time. In that silence I could hear Priscilla's voice in the background, though I could not make out words. Then Calvin said, "When did you do this?" I told him the truth. I told him I had started the process with Vivien's attorney 4 months ago, when I first received the documents she had left me and finally read them carefully enough to understand what she had been suggesting I do. The trust had been finalized and signed 6 weeks before Christmas. It was not a reaction to anything. It was simply something I had finally done that Vivien had been quietly asking me to do for years before she died. What Vivien had left me, beyond the financial inheritance, was clarity. She had left me a letter that laid out with her characteristic directness exactly what she had observed about my relationship with Calvin and Priscilla over the years. She did not name-call. She did not dramatize. She simply described what she had seen at family gatherings and holiday dinners and birthday visits. She described the way I was treated. She described the way I responded to that treatment. And then she said very plainly that she loved me and that she was frightened for me. Not because of anything dramatic or illegal, but because she had watched me slowly make myself smaller and smaller in the presence of my own son, and she was afraid that by the time I noticed how small I had become, it would be too late to recover the ground. The trust protected the house. It ensured that whatever happened in my lifetime, the house on Oleander Street would be handled according to my specific and legally documented wishes and not according to anyone else's assumptions or expectations or informal understandings. It also included a provision that Vivien's attorney had suggested based on something she had apparently mentioned to him during their meetings, which was that I had over the years made a series of financial gifts to Calvin, gifts that I had never documented, never described as loans, simply given because he needed them and I had them, and that is what mothers do. According to Vivien's notes, which her attorney had kept on file, the total of those undocumented gifts over 12 years came to $31,400. I had never added them up. I had genuinely never sat down and calculated the sum of what I had given because the act of calculating felt contrary to the spirit in which I had given. But Vivien had kept track because Vivien kept track of everything. And when I saw that number written in black ink on a legal document, I sat very still for a long time. Calvin did not know about that number yet. He did not know that Vivien had tracked it, or that her attorney had documented it, or that the letter in the envelope also referenced it in passing as a piece of context. He found out later, and I will get to that. On Christmas morning he was still processing the trust itself. He called back an hour after our first conversation. This time his voice was different. "Tighter," he said. "Mom, I need to understand what you're doing." He said, "I'm protecting what I built." He said, "Are you angry about last night?" I said, "Calvin, I'm not calling this conversation about last night." He said, "Then what is it about?" I said, "It's about all the nights before last night." There was a long pause. I heard Priscilla's voice again in the background, closer now. Then Calvin said he wanted to come and talk to me in person. Said not today. I said today is Christmas and I'm going to have a quiet day at home, and if he wanted to talk I was happy to do that, but I would need a few days first. He did not like that. He is not accustomed, I realized, to hearing me say no to his timeline. I spent Christmas Day alone, which I want to be clear was not a sad thing. I made a small roasted chicken and sweet potatoes and a piece of pecan pie I had bought from a bakery 2 days earlier. I called my oldest friend Dolores, who I have known since the 3rd grade, and we talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing in the way that only people who have known each other for 60 years can do. I watched a film I had been meaning to watch for months. I went to bed at 10 and slept well. Outside the Calvin situation, my life was actually quite good. I want to be clear about that too, because the Calvin situation had begun to take up so much mental space that I had started to forget it was not the whole of my life. I had friends. I had my garden. I had a watercolor class I attended on Tuesday evenings at the community center where I was slowly and imperfectly learning to paint the magnolia tree and enjoying the process enormously. I had my health, which at 67 is not something to take for granted. I had the house on Oleander Street, paid for and protected and full of the things I had chosen to surround myself with over a lifetime. I had Vivien's letter in the fireproof box, and I had the clarity it had given me. What I did not have, what I had not had for several years without fully admitting it to myself, was a son who made me feel like I mattered to him. That was the loss I was sitting with. Not the socks, not the $3 ticket, not even the BMW. Those were just symbols. The real thing was the slow accumulation of small moments over 6 or 7 years in which Calvin had shown me, not dramatically, not cruelly, but consistently and unmistakably, that I was not someone he was building his life around. I was someone he managed. There is a difference. I had been managed graciously for years and had accepted it because the alternative, which was acknowledging what it meant, was too painful to look at directly. Vivien had looked at it directly on my behalf. That was perhaps the greatest gift she ever gave me. Calvin came on the 28th. He called first to ask if he could come alone, without Priscilla. Said yes. He arrived at 2 in the afternoon in the BMW, which I noticed but did not comment on. He looked tired. He had the slightly hollowed look of a person who had not slept well for several days, which I recognized because I had seen it in the mirror enough times to know it well. I made coffee and we sat at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where I had sat on Christmas night with the $2 lottery win and the fireproof box. He looked around the kitchen in a way I had not seen him look at this house in a long time, as if he was seeing it rather than just moving through it. He said, "Mom, I want to understand what happened." I said, "Where would you like me to start?" He said, "The trust." "Why now? Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Calvin, it's my house. I'm not required to consult anyone about what I do with my own property." He was quiet. I could see him working to stay calm. He said, "I know that. I just mean, are you planning something? Are you thinking about?" He stopped, waited. He said, "Are you thinking about selling?" I said, "I'm not planning to sell. The trust is simply there to ensure that my wishes are clearly documented and legally protected. Vivien's attorney helped me set it up. It's a responsible thing to do." Calvin looked at his coffee cup. Then he said, "What are your wishes? In the trust. What does it say?" I said, "That's a private matter between me and my attorney. But I will tell you that your name is mentioned." He looked up. He said, "Not in the way you might be assuming. But it is mentioned." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I had not expected. He said, "Mom, I've been thinking about Christmas Eve. About the gift." Waited. He said, "It was wrong. I know it was wrong. I've known it since the moment you opened it." I said, "What made you do it, Calvin?" He didn't answer immediately. He turned his coffee cup slowly on the table. Then he said, "Priscilla and I had a conversation the week before Christmas. About money. About the future. About what we were planning for her parents." I said, "And where did I fit into that conversation?" He was quiet. I said, "Calvin, I'm not asking to make you feel bad. I'm asking because I genuinely want to understand what I am to you right now." He looked at the table. He said, "You're my mother." I said, "That's a category. I'm asking what I am to you." He did not answer. And the fact that he did not answer was, in its own way, an answer. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I said very calmly, "I want to tell you something about your Aunt Vivien. I want to tell you what she wrote to me." I got up and went to the bedroom and got the letter from the fireproof box. I came back and put it on the table. I said, "You can read this if you want. Or I can read it to you. But I want you to hear what someone who loved both of us saw." He picked up the letter. He read it slowly. I watched his face while he read, not to gauge his reaction but because I had not watched his face carefully in a long time and I found myself wanting to. He read for about 4 minutes. When he finished he put it down and sat very still. His jaw was set in the way it gets when he is feeling something he does not want to show. He said, "Vivien wrote this?" I said, "For months before she died." He nodded slowly. He said, "She was always watching." I said, "She was always paying attention. There's a difference." We sat in silence for a while. Not an uncomfortable silence, though it was not comfortable either. It was the silence of two people who are both sitting very close to a difficult truth and deciding whether to touch it. Calvin said, "I don't know how it got like this, Mom. With us." I said, "I think I do." He looked at me. I said, "I made it easy. I never pushed back. I kept showing up and being grateful and telling myself that your life was busy and that things would get better. I made disappearing very comfortable." He flinched slightly at that word. Disappearing. I said, "When you handed me that ticket on Christmas Eve and said everyone gets what they bring to the table, Calvin, what did you mean by that?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know why I said it." I said, "Yes, you do." He pressed his lips together. He said, "Priscilla thinks you don't respect our family. Home. The way we do things." I said, "Tell me one specific thing I have done to disrespect your family." He thought about it. He truly thought about it. I could see him searching. He said, "She feels like you're always judging." I said, "Has she ever told me that?" He said, "She doesn't feel like she should have to." I said, "Calvin, I need you to hear what you just said." He heard it. Could see the moment it landed. He rubbed the back of his neck and looked at the ceiling. He said, "Things are more complicated than I can explain right now." I said, "I know they are. I'm not asking for everything today. I'm asking for honesty." He said, "Okay." I said, "Do you know that your Aunt Vivien kept a record of every financial gift I gave you over the years?" He looked at me. I said, "Not as a transaction. She just kept track because she was Vivien. Total. Over 12 years is $31,400. He stared at me. I said, "I'm not telling you that to collect it back. I want that to be completely clear." I gave it freely. Every dollar. Pause. I said, "I'm telling you because I want you to understand what bringing something to the table has looked like from my side of this relationship, even when it was invisible to you." He looked like he had been struck. Not with anger. With something quieter. He said, "I didn't know it was that much." I said, "I didn't either until I read Vivien's notes." He put his face in his hands for a moment. Just a moment. Then he dropped his hands and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face in years, an expression I recognized from when he was a child sitting in my lap after something hurt him, before he learned that men were supposed to move through pain quickly. And without a fuss. He said, "Mom, I'm sorry." I said, "I know." He said, "That's not enough." I said, "No, it isn't. But it's a start." I refilled both our coffees. We sat for another 2 hours. We talked about things we had not talked about in years. He told me things about his marriage, about the pressures in his house, about the version of himself he had been performing for Priscilla's family. That surprised me not because I had not suspected them, but because he had never said them out loud before. I told him things about my own life, about retirement, about the watercolor class and Dolores and the magnolia tree, about how I had started building a life that made me happy after decades of organizing my happiness around him. He listened in a way I had not felt him listen in years, with his full attention, with a particular quality of presence that had always been one of his best qualities when he chose to use it. We did not resolve everything. We did not even address most things. But when he stood up to leave, there was something different in the room that had not been there when he arrived. Something tentative and fragile and real. He said, "Can I come back? Not to talk about the trust or money or any of that. Just to have coffee." I said, You can always come back for coffee, Calvin. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment looking at me, and I thought I saw the edge of something, the boy from Reed Street, quick to laugh and full of questions, the boy who cried at movies and brought me dandelions he called flowers, still present somewhere inside the composed, complicated man standing in front of me. He said, "I love you, Mom." I said, "I know. I love you too. Now go drive carefully in that ridiculous car." He almost smiled. Almost. After he left, I stood at the kitchen window watching the BMW back out of the driveway and disappear down Oleander Street. And then I stood there a while longer looking at the magnolia tree in the gray December light, bare and patient and waiting for spring the way it always was, the way it always would be. That visit was the beginning of something, though I did not know yet how long or difficult the beginning would be. The weeks after Christmas brought changes that moved in several directions at once. Some of them expected, several of them not. Priscilla called me on January 2nd. I was not expecting her call. And I will admit that when her name appeared on my screen, I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment before answering. She said, "Francis, I think we should talk." Her voice had a quality I had not heard in it before. Not exactly humble. More like carefully measured, the way a person sounds when they have been coached, or when they have rehearsed what they are about to say enough times to smooth most of the rough edges off it. I said, "Hello, Priscilla. How are you?" She said, "I've been thinking about Christmas. About how things went." I said, "I see." She said, "Calvin told me about the trust. And about the letter from Vivien." I said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know we've had our difficulties." I let that sit. She continued, "I don't think I've always been as welcoming to you as I should have been." I said, "What do you think got in the way?" He paused. She said, "I think I had ideas about what our family would look like. And sometimes people who don't fit those ideas, even when they love you, feel like a disruption." Thought about that. I said, "Priscilla, I appreciate you saying that. I want to ask you something honestly, and I would like an honest answer." She said, "Okay." I said, "Did you suggest the gift that Calvin gave me on Christmas Eve?" There was a long pause. Longer than any natural pause in a conversation that is going well. She said, "It was a joint decision." I said, "That's not quite what I asked." She said, "I may have suggested something simple. Practical." I said, "And Calvin agreed." She said, "Calvin wanted to please me." I said, "Yes. I've noticed that." The silence on the line was very complete. She said, "I'm not a terrible person, Francis." I said, "I know you're not. I've never thought you were a terrible person. I've thought you were a person who did some unkind things because nobody ever asked you to stop." She did not respond to that immediately. I said, "I'm glad you called. I want things to be better between us. That is genuinely true. But better means different than it has been. And I need you to understand that I am not available in the way I used to be available. I'm not coming to events where I'm made to feel invisible. I'm not accepting gifts that are designed to communicate contempt. I'm not pretending not to notice things I clearly notice. That version of our relationship is finished." She said, "I understand." I said, "I'm not sure you do yet. But I think you will." We ended the call politely. I sat at the kitchen table afterward and thought about Priscilla and what had just happened. Something had shifted, I could feel it, though I was not yet sure what that shift meant or where it would lead. Calvin continued to call every few days. The calls were different from before. Less transactional. Less updating. More like actual conversations between two people who are trying to remember why they like each other. He told me about his work, about a project he was managing that he was genuinely proud of. I told him about my watercolor class, about a painting I had made of the magnolia tree that my Tuesday evening teacher had said showed real feeling. He said he wanted to see it. I said he could come and see it. He came on a Saturday in mid-January. He arrived without Priscilla, which I did not ask about. He stood in the living room looking at the painting I had hung on the wall near the window. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Mom, this is really good." I said, "Don't sound so surprised." He laughed. It was a real laugh. The first real laugh I had heard from him in longer than I could track. We had lunch. He helped me fix a kitchen cabinet door that had been sticking for weeks, something he always used to do when he visited but had stopped doing somewhere along the way. We did not talk about Priscilla or money or the trust or Vivien's letter. We talked about other things. Normal things. The kind of things a mother and her son talk about when they are not managing a crisis. When he left that afternoon, he hugged me. A real hug. The kind that is not brief and slightly reluctant. The kind that means something. I stood at the door watching him go and felt something complicated and tender move through me, which I recognized as hope, though I handled it carefully. Because I had learned by then to hold hope lightly. In February, Priscilla's mother Darlene called me. This one I genuinely was not expecting. I knew Calvin and Priscilla had been speaking with both sets of parents about what had happened at Christmas, but I had not anticipated a call directly from Darlene. She said, "Francis, this is Darlene. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." I said, "Not at all. What can I do for you, Darlene?" She said, "I'll get right to the point. I heard about what happened at Christmas. About what you were given." Pause. "I want you to know that I did not know. I had no idea that was what Calvin was planning to give you." I said, "I see." She said, "I want you to know that if I had known, I would have said something." I listened to this and thought about it carefully. Darlene had always been pleasant to me on the surface. She had always said the right things at the right moments. But she had also spent 6 years treating me as a peripheral figure in her daughter's life while I was watching my son drift away. And I did not think she had earned the right to feel good about herself at my expense simply by making this call. I said, "Darlene, I appreciate you calling. I want to be honest with you. I don't know whether you knew or not. What I do know is that the dynamic in that house on Christmas Eve, the way the room was arranged, the way the attention was distributed, that didn't happen by accident. It was built over years. And you were part of building it, even if you weren't aware of it." She was quiet. Continued, "I'm not angry at you. I want to be very clear about that. But I also don't need your reassurance. What I need is for things to actually be different, not just described differently." She said, "That's fair." Pause. "You know, Priscilla called me after she talked to you. She said you were different than she expected." I said, "What did she expect?" Darlene said, "I think she expected you to be softer about it. To accept the apology and let it go and go back to how things were." I said, "That's not something I'm able to do." Darlene said, "I know. I think that's actually good." She said it with something in her voice that I did not expect, something that sounded like genuine respect. I thought about Darlene after that call, about the complexity of her position, about the ways that mothers carry their children's lives on their backs long after the children have grown, about how easy it is to enable the people you love without recognizing it as enabling. I felt something soften slightly toward her, not to the point of forgiveness for things she had not quite been asked to account for, but toward understanding. In March, Calvin told me that he and Priscilla were seeing a couples therapist. He did not make a large announcement about it. He mentioned it during one of our regular calls, casually, the way you mention something you have decided to stop being embarrassed about. He said, "We've been going every week. It's hard, but I think it's good." I said, "I'm glad." He said, "The therapist asked us to each write a list of the people in our lives we had taken for granted. I wrote your name first." He said it simply, without drama. I said, "Thank you for telling me that, Calvin." He said, "I should have known how to say it without someone making me write it on a list." I said, "Most people need help knowing how to say the things that matter. There's no shame in that." In April, Priscilla asked if she could come to my watercolor class with me. "Not permanently," she said. "Just once." She said she had been thinking about trying new things, about spending time with people she did not know in situations where she was not in charge. She said it sounded frightening and therefore probably important. I said she could come on Tuesday evening if she was serious about it. She came. She sat beside me at the long table in the community center with a blank canvas in front of her and tried to paint something. She was not good at it. She made several frustrated sounds and twice nearly knocked over her water cup. My instructor, a retired schoolteacher named Miss Odette who had 30 years of patience built into her bones, sat with Priscilla for a while and talked her through what she was trying to do, and something in Priscilla's shoulders relaxed during that conversation in a way I had not seen before. Afterward we walked to a small coffee shop around the corner and sat across from each other in a booth and had what was genuinely the first real conversation we had ever had. Not surface talk. Not careful managed pleasantries. An actual conversation. Priscilla talked about her childhood, about the pressure in her family to always appear certain and successful, about growing up in a house where vulnerability was treated as weakness and image was treated as substance. She said, "I don't actually know how to be in a relationship with someone who doesn't need anything from me. It makes me feel useless." I said, "Priscilla, I don't need anything from you. But I would like something." She looked at me. I said, "I would like for us to actually know each other. Not the versions we've been performing for 6 years. The real ones." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I don't know if the real one is someone you'll like." I said, "Try me." She almost smiled. We were there for 2 hours. By the time we walked back to our cars, something had changed between us. Not repaired. Not resolved. But opened in the way a window opens, letting in air that was not there before. I drove home thinking about Vivien and how she would have processed all of this. She would have been characteristically unsentimental about it. She would have said something like, "Don't mistake a beginning for an ending, Francis. Keep your eyes open and your documents filed." I laughed in my car alone at that thought. Vivien always made me laugh. In May, Calvin told me that he and Priscilla had decided to sell the house. The 4-bedroom colonial with the 3-car garage. He said it carefully, watching my face for a reaction. He said, "It was too much house. Too much everything. We bought it to look like something and we've been performing ever since we moved in." He said they were looking at smaller places, something they could actually afford without stretching, something that felt like a home rather than a demonstration. I said, "How does Priscilla feel about that?" He said, "It was her idea." I thought about that for a moment. I said, "I'm proud of you both." He looked slightly surprised, as if he had been expecting something more complicated. I said, "Calvin, I mean it. That is not a small thing to choose." He nodded. He said, "We're also talking about giving some money to her parents, helping them with their retirement planning." The BMW was impulsive and showy, and Priscilla knows that now. They want to do something real instead, something less about the gesture and more about the need. I said, "That sounds right." He said, "And Mom, I want to set something up for you. Properly. Something formal and real." I said, "Calvin." He said, "I know you don't need me to. I know you have the house and the trust and Vivien's planning. I know you're fine. But I need to do it. Not because you need it. Because I need to be the kind of son who does it." I looked at my child across the kitchen table, and I thought about Reed Street and the coat and the sewing machine and $31,400 and a Christmas night alone with a $2 scratch ticket and a fireproof box. I said, "All right, Calvin. We can talk about that." He exhaled. It was the exhale of someone putting down something they had been carrying without knowing it. By summer the house on Oleander Street had become something it had not been in a long time, a place my son came to willingly and regularly, not out of obligation, not for what he might need, but simply because he wanted to be there. He came on Saturday mornings and we made breakfast and talked about nothing in particular and everything in general. Priscilla came some of those mornings too. She was learning to be in a space that was not hers and not have opinions about how it was arranged. Which is harder than it sounds, and she was working at it sincerely. There were still difficult moments. There were still conversations that required care and patience from all of us. There were still times when I noticed the old patterns beginning to reassemble themselves and had to say clearly and calmly, "No, that is not how we are doing this anymore." But those moments were becoming less frequent. Something was being built. Something small and careful and real. I thought about Vivien often during those months. I thought about the letter she had written. I thought about the fact that she had died knowing I had not yet read it, trusting that I would when I was ready, trusting the timing of my own life even when she could not be there to see it. Vivien had watched me for 63 years, through everything. She had seen my marriage and its collapse. She had watched me raise Calvin alone. She had sat at my kitchen table 1,000 times, and she had known something I had spent decades refusing to know, which was that I had a habit of making myself less so that the people I loved could be more, and that this habit, built from love and sacrifice and the genuine desire to give, had a shadow side that I had never wanted to look at. The shadow side was this. By never asking for anything, by never naming what I needed, by accepting whatever was given with gratitude and composure, I had taught the people in my life that I had no needs. And people who are taught that you have no needs will eventually begin to believe it. They will not mean to be cruel. They will not feel that they are being unkind. They will simply organize their world around the information you have given them. And the information I had given everyone for decades was that Frances Whitmore was fine and asking nothing and grateful for whatever came her way. Vivien saw that clearly and was afraid of it and wrote me a letter. And trusted me to find my way to it when I was ready. I found my way to it on Christmas night with a $2 lottery win in my coat pocket and 30 years of invisible giving in my blood. The envelope I left under Calvin's Christmas tree was not revenge. I want to be clear about that because I think it is important. It was not a punishment and it was not a power move and it was not designed to frighten anyone. It was a communication. It was me saying, in the most unambiguous language available to me, that I existed, that I had built something, that I had planned carefully and acted deliberately, and that the version of Frances Whitmore who could be handed a $3 scratch ticket and absorbed it without a word was the last version of her they were going to see. The trust was real. The attorney was real. The documents were filed and signed and irrevocable. And the $31,400 was a number that would sit in Calvin's memory for the rest of his life, not as a debt but as a fact about what had been invisible and what was now visible and what that meant about the story he had been telling himself about his mother and her place in his life. In September, on what would have been Vivien's 65th birthday, I went to the cemetery and sat at her grave with 2 cups of coffee from the bakery she used to love, one for me and one for her, which I know is a small absurdity and also completely right. I told her what had happened. I told her about the calls and the conversations and Priscilla at the watercolor class and Calvin fixing the kitchen cabinet and the Saturday mornings and the fact that things were not perfect but were becoming something I could actually feel and not just describe. I told her that her letter had done exactly what she intended it to do. I told her that I missed her every single day and that I was going to keep missing her in the way you miss someone who was so completely themselves that the world has a different shape without them. I told her I was going to be all right. And sitting there in the September sun with 2 cups of coffee and the sound of leaves beginning to turn, I knew it was true. October brought a surprise I had not anticipated. Priscilla called me on a Tuesday afternoon, not a scheduled call, just an ordinary Tuesday call. She said, "Frances, I have something I want to ask you and you can absolutely say no." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "My mother's birthday is in November. I'm planning a small dinner, just family, and I want you to be there." I said, "As a guest, or as part of the family?" She said, "As family. I want to introduce you that way, properly, to everyone who was at Christmas." I thought about Christmas Eve. The printed name cards with the holly leaf in the corner. The swinging kitchen door and the cold air on the back of my neck. My place card in plain white. I said, "Will there be room for me at the main table?" Priscilla said, "You'll be sitting next to me." I said, "Then yes. I'll be there." She said, "Thank you, Frances." There was something in how she said it, the weight of it, that told me she understood what she was asking and why it mattered and what it cost her to ask it. I said, "I'll bring something. What does your mother like?" Priscilla laughed. She said, "She would absolutely love your sweet potato pie if that's not too much trouble." I said, "It's no trouble at all." I made the pie on a Friday evening with the radio on and the kitchen warm, measuring the sweet potatoes and the brown sugar and the spices that had been my mother's recipe and her mother's before that. There is something deeply settling about making food you have made 100 times, about the particular satisfaction of a task your hands know. Without instruction, I thought about all the holiday meals I had made over the years. The Christmas dinners on Reed Street when it was just Calvin and me and the table was small and the gifts were modest and the warmth in that apartment came entirely from the two of us choosing to make it warm. I thought about how much I had loved those years even while they were hard. I thought about how much I loved this kitchen and this house and this life I had built. Darlene's birthday dinner was small and warm and genuinely different from Christmas Eve in ways that I noticed and appreciated. I was introduced to Priscilla's relatives as Calvin's mother, which sounds ordinary but in the context of everything that had come before it sounded like exactly what it was, a correction. A placing of things properly. Gerald stood up when I entered the room. It was a small thing and he may not have even thought about it consciously, but I noticed. I noticed and felt the particular quiet satisfaction of something that had been wrong being made slightly right. Darlene hugged me at the door and said the pie smelled like someone who knew what they were doing. I said, "It's my grandmother's recipe." She said, "You'll have to give it to me." I said, "I'll write it down for you." At dinner I sat at the main table with Priscilla on one side and Calvin on the other, and I was not near any door that opened onto the cold. The conversation moved around me and included me and felt, for the first time in years, like something I belonged to rather than something I was merely present for. I thought of Vivien once at dinner, in the middle of someone telling a story, a quick thought that passed through like light. She would have made a dry, precise comment about something and then looked at me with one eyebrow raised, and I would have had to press my lips together to keep from laughing out loud. Missed her. And I was also sitting at that table in October, genuinely happy. Those two things can live together. Have learned that. After dinner, while people were having coffee and dessert in the living room, Darlene found me in the kitchen where I was helping clear dishes. She said, "Francis, can I say something?" I said, "Of course." She said, "I've been thinking about Christmas Eve a great deal. About what we all participated in, knowingly or not." "Waited," she said. "I had a role in making you feel like a guest in your son's life. I was comfortable with an arrangement that was not fair to you and I didn't examine it because it was comfortable." I said, "Darlene, I appreciate this." She said, "I'm not finished." "Waited," she said. "Gerald and I had a long conversation after everything came out. About what we expect from our son-in-law and daughter and whether those expectations ever considered you. We decided that they did not." She said, "The BMW was a wonderful gift and I love my car. But I also know that it came from a marriage where Francis Whitmore had been made invisible for years, and that the money that paid for it was accumulated in a household where your contribution was never acknowledged." I said, "That is a very honest thing to say." She said, "Vivien sounds like she was a remarkable woman." I said, "She was the most honest person I have ever known." Darlene nodded. She said, "I would have liked her." I said, "She would have liked you. Eventually." Darlene laughed. It was the first time I had ever heard Darlene laugh, really laugh. Not the social performance of a laugh but the real one that catches you off guard. I liked her considerably more in that moment than I ever had. We finished clearing the dishes and went back to join the others, and I did not feel invisible and I did not feel like furniture and I did not feel like someone to be managed or tolerated. I felt like Frances Elaine Whitmore, 67 years old, standing in a room full of people who were slowly and imperfectly learning that she was someone worth seeing. By December, the house on Oleander Street was decorated for Christmas in the way I had always loved, which was simply and warmly. A wreath on the door and lights along the porch railing and a small tree in the living room with the ornaments I had collected over 40 years of Christmases, some of them Calvin's. Handmade ornaments from elementary school. Painted and glittered and slightly lopsided in the way of things made by small hands doing their best. I put those up every year without fail. They are my favorite ones on the tree. Calvin came the week before Christmas to help me put up the lights outside. He stood on the ladder and I handed things up to him and directed from the ground with the critical authority of a woman who knows exactly how she wants her lights hung, and he argued. with me about it in the cheerful way of someone who is arguing not because he wants to win but because the argument itself is a form of closeness. Priscilla came with him and sat on the porch steps drinking hot chocolate and occasionally offering opinions that Calvin and I both ignored affectionately. It was cold and bright and ordinary in the best possible way. Inside I had a pot of soup on the stove, and after the lights were done we came in and ate at the kitchen table. The three of us in the warm kitchen of the house on Oleander Street that I had bought 22 years ago with 6 years of careful saving and paid off 14 months ago and placed in a trust on a December night with a $2 scratch-off in my coat pocket. It was a good evening. It was an ordinary good evening of the kind that does not make stories but makes lives. On Christmas Day itself, Calvin and Priscilla invited me to their new home, a modest 3-bedroom. In a quiet neighborhood that felt, from the moment I walked in, like a place 2 people actually lived rather than a place 2 people performed in. It was warm and slightly cluttered in a comfortable way, and the Christmas tree was in the corner with its lights reflecting off the window glass, and there was music playing and something good cooking in the kitchen. I brought the sweet potato pie again because it had clearly become a thing I brought now, which I did not object to in the slightest. We exchanged gifts after dinner. Calvin gave me a framed photograph, a large one in a simple wooden frame. It was the photograph from their wedding, the one that had been hanging in the hallway of the old house, but this one was different. He had taken it to be reprinted and recropped. I was in the front of this version. No longer behind Priscilla's uncle. No longer partial and half visible. I was clearly, completely, unmistakably there. I held the photograph for a long time. I did not say anything for a moment. Calvin said, "I'm sorry it took me so long to see you." I said, "You see me now. That's what matters." Priscilla gave me a small wrapped box. Inside was a pair of hand-painted earrings from a local artist, simple and beautiful, the kind of gift that says I thought about who you are and what you might love rather than what is easy or impressive. I put them on at the table and Darlene, who was there with Gerald in the smaller, warmer version of what Christmas had been the year before, said they suited me perfectly. I gave Calvin a painting. It was the magnolia tree, not my early classroom attempts but a new one I had made over several sessions in the autumn when the tree had gone from its spring bloom through to its bare winter state, and I had painted it in that transitional moment, between the fullness and the bare, when something still lives in the shape of a thing. Even after the flowers are gone. He looked at it for a long time. He said, "Mom, this is really something." I said, "Your Aunt Vivien always believed I was an artist. I'm choosing to believe her." He hung it in their living room right then, that evening while I watched. He found a nail and a hammer and hung it above the mantel and stood back and looked at it and then looked at me. And I looked at the painting on my son's wall, the painting I had made with my own hands, of the tree I had watched from my kitchen window for 22 years. And I felt something move through me that was too full and too complete to name with a single word. It was not triumph. It was not vindication. It was not the satisfaction of being proven right or the relief of an ending. It was something simpler and more sustaining than any of those things. It was presence. The simple, complete, irreducible experience of being present in your own life, of being seen by the people who matter to you, of mattering in the ways you actually are rather than in the ways that are convenient for others to acknowledge. I had built that. Not alone. Not without Vivien's careful love and planning. Not without the hard conversations of that year and the patience they required. But I had built it. Frances Elaine Whitmore had built it. The woman from Reed Street who sold her sewing machine and shared her coat and kept her composure in a bright living room, holding a $3 lottery ticket while the rest of the world celebrated around her. I drove home from Calvin's house that Christmas night along roads that were quiet and dark and familiar, and I thought about the Christmas exactly 1 year before, the drive through the icy dark with my heater on its single setting, and the house on Oleander Street waiting with its lights off, and the fireproof box I had opened for the first time in the bedroom, and Vivien's letter that had been waiting patiently for me to be ready for it. I thought about how much can change in a year when a person decides to stop making themselves smaller. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a moment looking at the house, at the porch lights I had left on, at the wreath on the door and the lights along the railing that Calvin had helped me hang. It looked exactly like what it was. Home. Built and paid for and protected and full of 47 years of a life lived with intention, even when the intention was imperfect, even when the sacrifices were invisible, even when the woman inside was smaller than she deserved to be. I went inside. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet and thought about Vivien and about the year that had passed and about the year that was coming, and I felt, in the particular deep way of someone who has earned it, entirely at peace. At peace with my son and the complicated, careful, real relationship we were rebuilding. At peace with Priscilla and the slow and earnest work she was doing to become someone different. At peace with Darlene, who had surprised me, and Gerald, who had stood up when I entered the room, and Miss Odette, who had taught me to paint what I felt, and Dolores, who had known me since the 3rd grade and would know me, I hoped, for 30 years more. At peace with the house on Oleander Street and the magnolia tree. And the fireproof box and the trust and the $31,400 that had been invisible and was now visible and would never be invisible again. At peace with Vivien. My precise, careful, loving, honest sister who had watched me my whole life and seen me when I could not see myself, and who had left me the one thing I needed most, which was not money, though the money helped, and not legal documents, though the documents mattered, but the simple, clear, unwavering conviction that I deserved to take up space. I sat at the kitchen table until the tea was finished and the house was completely quiet, and then I went to bed. And I slept the deep, uncomplicated sleep of someone who has put down a weight they did not know they were carrying and discovered, in the putting down of it, how strong they actually are. The magnolia tree was outside in the cold and the dark, patient and bare and full of next spring, the way it always was. And inside the house on Oleander Street, Frances Elaine Whitmore was sleeping soundly in the home she had built and protected and would never again apologize for occupying. I want to say one more thing before I leave you with this story. Not about the trust or the letters or the conversations that changed things. About something smaller. That $2 scratch-off I won on Christmas night. The snowflake ticket with its $2 prize. I still have it. It is in the fireproof box, right next to Vivien's letter. Not as a symbol of what I endured, and not as a reminder of what was done to me. I keep it because of what it accidentally said. Maybe you'll get lucky this year, Calvin had written on the note. And I had scratched off that ticket and won $2, which was exactly what the ticket was worth, not a penny more. And I had looked at that $2 win and thought, yes, Calvin, I'm going to get lucky. Not in the way you imagined. Not with a windfall from a gas station scratch-off. But in the way that actually matters. I'm going to be lucky enough to finally see myself clearly. Lucky enough to act on what I see. Lucky enough to have a sister who loved me enough to plan for the moment I was ready. Lucky enough to have a son who, when it came to it, chose to be someone I could be proud of. Lucky enough to live in a house I own outright and a life I have built myself and a future that belongs entirely to me. That is a remarkable kind of luck. The kind you do not scratch off a ticket to find. The kind you build slowly and carefully and sometimes painfully, out of the choices you make when the room goes quiet and everyone is waiting to see if you will absorb it and smile. I did not absorb it. I smiled because my grandmother taught me to, and then I went home and opened a box, and started building something different. That is the whole of it. That is everything. And if any part of this story lives somewhere in your own life, if you have ever been handed something that communicated exactly how much you were worth to someone who should have known better, I want you to know something. Not that it gets better automatically. Not that people always change. Not that every family finds its way back to something real. Some do. Some don't. What I want you to know is this. Your worth is not determined by what someone hands you in a room full of people who are waiting to see your reaction. Your worth is what you have built and protected and carried forward through every year of your life while someone else was not paying attention. It was always there. It is still there. And there is no scratch-off in the world that can tell you otherwise. Take care of yourselves, dear ones. Go open whatever box you have been afraid to open. The letter inside is waiting for you. Has always been waiting. After that December evening at Calvin and Priscilla's house, life on Oleander Street moved into the new year with a quality it had lacked for a long time. Something lighter in the mornings, something easier in the evenings. A sense of having set down a burden whose full weight I had not measured until it was gone. January came with its cold gray days, and I moved through them without the particular dread I had carried through so many Januaries before. The watercolor class resumed after the holidays, and I went back on the first Tuesday with a new small canvas I had bought myself as a Christmas present, and I worked on a painting of the bare magnolia branches against the winter sky, which Miss Odette said had the quality of patience in it, which I thought was perhaps the finest thing anyone had said about my work. Calvin came on the third Saturday of January the way he had come on Saturdays throughout the autumn, arriving before 10 with coffee from the bakery around the corner, 2 cups, one for each of us, a small habit that had established itself without announcement and now felt, in the way of small good habits, completely natural and impossible to imagine being without. We sat in the kitchen and talked. About his work, which was going well. About Priscilla and the therapy, which was continuing. About the new house and the neighborhood, and a neighbor's dog that had taken to following Priscilla on her morning walks, which she professed to find irritating and clearly loved. I told him about the watercolor class and the magnolia painting and a book I was reading that Dolores had recommended and a conversation I had with my doctor about bone density, which was not as alarming as it sounded and was simply something to attend to thoughtfully, which I was. These are the conversations of ordinary life. Not dramatic. Not heavy with history or consequence. Just the accumulation of days and the sharing of them, which is the whole substance of closeness when you clear away everything else. By February, Priscilla had begun coming to the Tuesday watercolor class regularly. She was still not good at it and remained loudly aware of that fact, which made her excellent company. She had a particular ongoing battle with perspective that Miss Odette addressed weekly with the patience of a saint, and Priscilla's inability to accept that a table corner could look like that in a painting was both frustrating to her and genuinely funny to everyone around her. She had also, I noticed, begun to laugh at herself. Not performed laughter, not the social kind, but the real kind that comes from having decided that your dignity does not depend on being competent at everything. That was a significant change. I noticed it without commenting on it, which felt like the right thing to do. In March, Darlene and I had lunch. She had called and asked if I would be interested, and I had said yes without hesitation, which surprised me slightly, and then upon reflection did not surprise me at all. We met at a small restaurant near the Botanical Garden and sat for 3 hours and talked the way women talk when they have decided to actually know each other, which is to say with very little wasted time on the surface of things and a great deal of time on everything below. Darlene had grown up in circumstances much more difficult than she presented to the world, which I had not known. She had built her confidence and her polish and her capacity to occupy a room like someone who had always belonged there entirely through effort and will and the fierce refusal to let her origins define her ceiling. I understood that completely. I told her so. She looked at me with the expression of someone who has not often been understood and said, "You know, Francis, I think if we had met differently, we would have been friends a long time ago." I said, "We met the way we met. This is what we have." She said, "I'll take it." We had lunch twice more that spring. Gerald came to Oleander Street in April to look at a plumbing issue I had been putting off addressing, because it turned out that Gerald had spent several years as a contractor before moving into property management and knew considerably more about residential plumbing than his expensive sweater suggested. He spent 2 hours under my kitchen sink and fixed the problem with a competence and focus that were impressive and also genuinely touching, the way competent kindness always is. He did not make it a gesture or a statement. He simply fixed the thing and washed his hands and accepted a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table for half an hour talking about houses, about what they require and what they give back, about the particular satisfaction of maintaining something that matters. He said, "You've taken good care of this place." I said, "I've tried to." He looked around the kitchen with genuine appreciation and said, "It shows." I thought about Christmas Eve and the watch and the toast and his eyes passing over me like furniture, and I thought about him now, in my kitchen with grease on his hands from fixing my pipes, and I thought about how long it takes sometimes for people to become who they actually are, how much time we waste on the performances we think are required of us, and how quietly and completely everything can shift when someone decides to stop performing. The spring was warm that year, earlier than usual, and the magnolia tree bloomed in late March, which was 2 full weeks ahead of schedule and felt like a gift. I sat on my porch the morning the first flowers opened and had my coffee looking at it and thought about all the springs I had watched it bloom, the ones alone with Calvin as a child, the ones alone after he left for college, the ones alone after he married Priscilla, and my Saturdays became empty in a way I had trained myself not to name. And then I thought about this spring, and about the Saturday Calvin had come the week before and sat on this same porch with me, and about Priscilla at the watercolor class on Tuesday evening, and about Dolores who was coming for lunch on Wednesday, and about Miss Odette who had said my painting of the bare branches had patience in it, and about Vivien whose birthday I would mark in September with 2 cups of coffee from the bakery, and about the fireproof box with its trust documents and its $2 scratch-off and its letter, and I thought, here it is. Here is the life. Not the life I was managing and enduring and composing my face for. The one I was actually living. The one that was mine. I painted the blooming magnolia tree that spring. It took me 4 sessions and 2 ruined attempts, and a great deal of conversation with Miss Odette about how to capture the particular quality of white flowers against a pale spring sky without losing one in the other. The finished painting was the best thing I had made. When I looked at it, I could feel the morning and the coffee and the warmth and the deep, uncomplicated pleasure of being alive and present and awake to it. I hung it in the bedroom. I wanted it to be the first thing I saw in the morning. Vivien would have said something perfectly dry and exactly right about the magnolia painting. She would have looked at it for a long moment and then said, "Francis, you've made a painting of yourself." And she would have been right. She was always right. I miss her with a completeness that does not diminish, only changes shape over time, the way grief does when it belongs to love, rather than to loss. She gave me clarity. She gave me language. She gave me the legal and financial architecture of a protected life. She gave me permission, really, to take up the space I had always occupied but never claimed. That is what the letter said in the end, beneath all its practical precision. You have always been here, Francis. Start acting like it. In June, Calvin told me that Priscilla was pregnant. He told me on a Saturday morning. At the kitchen table with his coffee cup in his hands, and something on his face that was equal parts joy and terror, and the particular vulnerability of a man standing at the edge of something enormous. I did not speak for a moment. I just looked at him. Then I reached across the table and took his hand, the way I had taken his hand when he was small and frightened of things, and I held it for a moment. He said, "I want to be different, Mom. As a parent, I want to do it differently than I've been doing everything else." I said, "I know you do." He said, "I'm scared I don't know how." I said, "You will learn. The way everyone learns. By paying attention and trying and being willing to be wrong and trying again." He nodded. He said, "I'm going to need your help." I said, "You have it. You always had it." He squeezed my hand and then let go and picked up his coffee, and we sat together in the morning. Kitchen of the house on Oleander Street with the magnolia tree outside already past its bloom and into its full summer green and the whole long warm season stretching ahead. A grandchild was coming. I turned this thought slowly in my mind, feeling its weight and its wonder. A grandchild was coming to a family that had, in the past year, made the difficult choice to become real. Not perfect. Not resolved. Not without its complications and its history and all the things that would still need tending. But real. Present to each other. Willing to be seen. A grandchild was coming, and Frances Elaine Whitmore was going to be there. Fully and completely and without apology. As the grandmother she actually was rather than the one it was convenient for anyone to acknowledge. I thought about Vivien. I thought about Reed Street and the coat and the sewing machine and the $31,400 and the Christmas night and the fireproof box. I thought about everything it had taken to arrive at this kitchen table on this June morning holding my son's hand while he told me I was going to be a grandmother. And I thought, all right then. Here we are. Here is what the building was for. In September, on Vivien's birthday, I went to the cemetery with 2 coffees as I had promised myself I would. I sat at her grave in the warm September sun, and I told her about the baby coming. I told her that Calvin and Priscilla were doing well and that Darlene and I had lunch again last week and that Gerald fixed my kitchen pipes in April and that Miss Odette said my magnolia painting had real feeling and that Dolores was still Dolores and that the house was standing and the trust was filed and the magnolia tree was already preparing for next spring in the invisible way trees do, storing up what they need before the cold comes. I told her I was going to be fine. I told her I already was. She knew. She always knew. She had simply been waiting, with characteristic patience and precision, for me to catch up. I put my hand on the warm stone of her grave and sat with her in the September sun for a long time, the 2 coffees growing cold beside me, and felt the whole long shape of our lives together. 63 years of sisterhood. 63 years of her watching and knowing and waiting for the right moment to say the right thing in exactly the right way. I said out loud, the way you say things at graves that you would say nowhere else. You were the best person I knew, Vivien. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving you right. The September sun was warm on my face. Somewhere nearby a bird was singing something elaborate and pleased with itself, and the cemetery was quiet in the deep afternoon way of places that hold a great deal of time carefully. I stood up and straightened my jacket and picked up the 2 cold coffees and walked back to my car. I drove home to Oleander Street. I went inside and put the kettle on and stood at the kitchen window looking at the magnolia tree in its September green, still full and holding, not yet ready to let go of the warmth, and I thought about what was coming. The autumn and then the winter and then the spring when the tree would bloom again and Calvin's child would be here in the world. And everything would be new and ordinary and complicated and beautiful in the way that things are when you stop pretending they are simpler than they are and start loving them as exactly what they are. The kettle boiled. I made my tea. I sat down at the kitchen table where I had sat on so many evenings with so many different feelings, and I opened my notebook, the one I kept for the watercolor class, and I began to sketch the magnolia tree in the September light. Not perfectly. Not with any great technical skill. But with attention and care and the pleasure of someone who has learned that the purpose of making something beautiful is not to produce perfection but to practice presence. That is the whole lesson. Pay attention. Show up. Take up the space you have earned. Name what you need. Protect what you have built. And when someone hands you something designed to tell you exactly how little you are worth to them, do not absorb it. Do not fold it quietly into your coat pocket and smile. Set it down. Open the box. Read the letter. Find the attorney. File the documents. Drive home through the dark. Sleep. And then, in the morning, begin. My name is Frances Elaine Whitmore. I am 67 years old. I live in the house on Oleander Street. My magnolia tree blooms every spring. I am building something that will outlast the people who underestimated me. And I have never once been ashamed of either. This story is for everyone who has ever made themselves smaller so the people they loved could feel larger. For everyone who has ever stood in a bright room holding something cheap and smiled because they were raised to be gracious, even when graciousness was not deserved. For everyone who has a Vivien in their life, someone who watches and knows and waits for the right moment to hand you the truth you were not quite ready to receive. And for everyone who has been that Vivien for someone else, watching and waiting and loving them carefully enough to plan for the future even when you could not be there to see it. Your watching mattered. Your planning mattered. Your love, offered in those precise and practical ways that the world does not always recognize as love, mattered enormously. This is for all of you. Keep your documents filed. Keep your boxes fireproof. Keep your eyes open and your spine straight and your grandmother's recipe close. And when the tree blooms, sit on the porch with your coffee and watch it. You have earned every petal. If this story found you where you live, if any part of Frances's year felt like something you recognized in your own kitchen or your own family or your own heart, please leave a comment and tell me what moved you. Your words keep this community alive. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that invisible does not mean unimportant, that quiet does not mean powerless, and that the woman standing in the back of the photograph was always the most important person in the room. And if you are new here, subscribe to Granny's Voice. Every week we bring you stories about ordinary women who chose themselves and changed everything. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying until the very end. You are exactly the kind of person this story was made for. And one last thing. Go check on your mother. Call her this week. Not to ask for something. Not to update her on your schedule. Just to ask how she is, to listen to the answer, to let her know that you see her. Really see her. The way she has always seen you. Even when you were not paying attention. Especially then. I will see you in the next story. Take good care of yourselves and each other. This is Granny's Voice, and every story we tell here is a story about someone who refused to disappear. Frances Elaine Whitmore did not disappear. And neither, dear listener, will you. The closing of one year and the opening of another is always a kind of doorway. We stand in it briefly, looking back at what we are leaving and forward at what we are entering. And in that pause between the two, if we are lucky or deliberate or simply awake enough to notice, we can feel the full weight of what we have carried and the full possibility of what we might set down. Frances stood in that doorway at the end of her 67th year and felt both things completely. She had carried a great deal. For a very long time. She had carried it with grace and with competence, and with a particular pride of a woman who had been raised to handle what came her way without making a spectacle of the handling. That pride had served her well for decades. It had also cost her. What it had cost her was the ability to ask for what she needed, to name what she was owed, to say out loud in a room full of people that her presence mattered and her contributions were real and her dignity was not a gift anyone had the right to withhold. She had learned to say those things, not easily, not without effort, not without the help of a dead woman's careful letter and a fireproof box, and an attorney who specialized in exactly the kind of quiet protection that women like Frances required. And almost never asked for. She had learned. And having learned, she would not unlearn. The house on Oleander Street would stand. The trust would hold. The magnolia tree would bloom in the spring the way it always had. Patient and certain, and entirely unconcerned with whether anyone was watching. And Frances Elaine Whitmore would be on her porch when it did, with her coffee and her notebook and her reading glasses, watching the tree and thinking about Vivien and about Calvin and about the grandchild who would arrive in the early months of the new year, a small new person entering a family that had chosen, after considerable difficulty and at considerable cost, to become real. She would be there for all of it, fully present. Fully herself, occupying the space she had earned with 31 years of factory floors and 9 years of county administration and 22 years of mortgage payments and one late December night when she had opened a fireproof box and decided that Vivien was right. She would be there. She had always been there. Now she was there with her eyes open. That is the difference. That is everything. That is enough. If you would like to hear more stories like this one, stories about women who build and protect and persevere and ultimately claim the lives they have earned, please subscribe to Granny's Voice and share this video with someone who needs to know that the woman who has always been there. For everyone else deserves to have someone show up for her too. She deserves more than a scratch-off ticket. She deserves more than a seat by the cold door. She deserves the front row, the framed photograph, the sweet potato pie recipe carried down through generations, and the deep knowing quiet satisfaction of sitting in a home she built herself while the magnolia tree gets ready to bloom again. She always did deserve it. She just needed someone to remind her. And sometimes that someone is a sister who loved you carefully enough to plan for the moment you were finally ready to receive the truth. Rest well, Vivien. Your letter found her. Frances is gonna be just fine. And now, finally, truly, from the house on Oleander Street on a quiet winter evening with the lights on the porch railing glowing soft and steady into the dark, this is Granny's voice saying good night. Stay warm. Stay whole. Keep your documents filed. And remember that every woman who has ever made herself small enough to fit into someone else's idea of her place has also, whether she knows it or not, been quietly gathering the strength to take up every inch of the space she was always meant to fill. That gathering is not wasted. It is not invisible. It is not forgotten. It is waiting, patient as a magnolia in winter, for the day she is ready to bloom. That day comes. It always comes. For Frances it came on a December night in the 67th year of her life, sitting at her kitchen table with a $2 scratch-off and a fireproof box and finally, the willingness to open it. May your day come soon. May your box be waiting. May your magnolia bloom. This has been Granny's Voice. Thank you for being here. We will see you next time. Until then, take care of yourselves and each other. And remember, the woman standing in the back of the photograph, the one who made the food and paid the bills and showed up quietly for decades without asking to be thanked, she is the story. She has always been the story. It is time for her to stand in the front. It is time for the photograph to be reframed. And it has been. This is Granny's Voice, and we are not done yet. The magnolia is not done either. Next spring it will bloom again, fuller and more certain. than it has ever been, because the woman watching from the porch finally knows what she is looking at. Herself blooming. Right on time. From all of us at Granny's Voice, thank you. Good night. Take good care. We will see you in the next story. And to Frances Elaine Whitmore, wherever you are, in whatever kitchen, at whatever table, with whatever box you have not yet opened, this is your story. It was always your story. Now you know how it ends. With the lights on. With the trust filed. With the magnolia blooming. With your son on your porch and your sister's letter in your hand and your whole extraordinary ordinary life spread out before you, every year of it, every sacrifice, every dollar, every cold morning and every warm cup of tea, every painting made imperfectly and with love, every moment of dignity quietly, stubbornly, magnificently protected. That is not a small life. That is an enormous one. Go live it. This is Granny's Voice. We will see you next time. Good night, Frances. Good night, everyone. Thank you for staying until the very last word. You always were exactly what this story needed. Listener. A witness. Someone who understands that the quietest people in the room are sometimes the ones carrying the most, and that they deserve, every last one of them, to be finally, fully, beautifully heard. This story is complete. Frances Elaine Whitmore rests. Vivien's letter has done its work. Oleander Street is quiet and warm and lit from within. And somewhere in the cold winter dark outside, the magnolia tree is already preparing for spring. Patient, certain, ready, just like her. Good night. This is Granny's Voice. And we are not done yet. We are never done. There is always another story. There is always another woman who has been standing in the back of the photograph waiting to be moved to the front. We find her. We tell her story. We make sure it is heard. That is what we do here. That is what we will always do. Subscribe. Or come back. And bring someone with you who needs to hear that quiet endurance and invisible sacrifice and composed dignity in the face of contempt are not signs of weakness. They are signs of extraordinary, unbreakable, magnificent strength. That strength is Frances. That strength is Vivien. That strength is you. This is Granny's Voice. We will see you next time. Take good care. And remember the magnolia. It always blooms. Good night. Thank you. We are so glad you were here. Until next time, Granny's Voice signing off. Be well. Be strong. Be seen. You have earned every single petal. The story of Frances Elaine Whitmore ends here, on Oleander Street, in the house she built and protected and loved for 22 years. It ends with the lights on and the trust filed and the magnolia ready for spring. It ends with a son who came back and a sister who never really left and a life that is, at last, completely and unapologetically her own. That is not a small ending. That is the only ending that was ever worth having. Thank you for being here. Granny's Voice. Good night.